Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. Thank you very much for joining us right now. So, first of all, we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, Stephen, for being with us weekly, and also you, the audience, for joining us. So, S.Friedman is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher, artist, scientist, and also a great speaker of ours. Thank you very much, Stephen, for being with us. So thank you, the audience. Stay active and ask your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aliyah, for the introduction. As always, I want to thank the U.S. Consulate in Almaty for providing this platform for weekly philosophical talks. I want to, in particular, thank, Aliyah, Dana, Elmira, and everybody involved in facilitating these talks and discussions, exchanges on philosophical issues ranging over a wide range of concerns. The idea is to address circumstances, issues from a variety of sources. A lot of what I talk about is derived from international days of the United Nations. And so I decided, in looking at their calendar a couple of weeks ago for what an upcoming International Day celebration was going to be, well, I was struck by the motto of the United Nations on their website, on the site announcing their international days, but also on their main website, the main homepage of their website. And that motto is peace, dignity, and equality. And it continues. I think the last part was added subsequently, on a healthy planet. Obviously, issues of climate change have merited the addition of that last phrase. But the core of the United Nations mission has been promoting peace, dignity, and equality. Now, I know I've talked about those individually in talks in the past, but I thought, given the fact that they coalesce, converge, in the United Nations motto, I would take advantage of that to discuss something about their interrelationship in connection with the United Nations, its mission, its aspirations, and always in a broadly and deeply philosophical context. So we'll see how those things can be achieved within the basic parameters of the United Nations, and how they can be perceived or achieved philosophically in a different direction. Now, first, it turns out next week, Kazakhstan is celebrating its Independence Day. And so this talk, we will not have a talk next week. The subsequent talk will be on the 24th, I think it is, yes. So next week, we'll be taking a break. But one of the questions that was asked last time was about, the title of that poem that I read at the end, Emily is a Diamond, and where other such writings might be available. And hundreds of my writings are available on my main website. And so I thought I would, at the end, give you a little tour. I've done this once before, but it was a long time ago, and I know we have new viewers. So I would give a little introduction again to the website and show you how to find some of the things that I've referred to repeatedly in these talks. So that would include the books of Joshua that I quote from often, Emily is a Diamond, and other writings, especially aphoristic books. Sometimes I quote from those in their entirety. I'm going to be doing that tonight at the close of the talk. So when I'm not talking next week, you'll be able to go to some of that source material if you want to reference some of the philosophical writings that serve as the background to these talks. Okay, this is not a history series, but So I don't want to give you a detailed history of the United Nations. That's available on their website, for example, and in many places, the United Nations is one of the most prominent organizations on Earth and has been for the last 3/4 of a century. But I want to make a few remarks. What I'd like to do is to emphasize things that might have made an impact on me, that have stayed with me for a number of years that may not be commonly known or commonly encountered. Okay, so I think it's reasonable to point out that the United Nations begins with the failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an international organization that had been proposed and instituted after World War I. The League of Nations was instituted because of the ultimate failure of the peace that had been engineered after the Napoleonic Wars, the peace engineered by the Austrian diplomat Metternich, who thought in terms of a balance of power among competing rival nations that, if carefully preserved, could preserve the peace. Well, it was preserved for a century. That was a major achievement in terms of avoiding, a massive international conflict on the scale of the Napoleonic Wars, or subsequently World War I. But that peace, that structure that had maintained stability, harmony relatively during the 19th century, failed in 1914. And that failure precipitated the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who presided over the US entry into World War I, to propose a league, an international organization to help maintain the peace, maintain that careful, if you like, balance of power, but diplomatically among nations, to avoid another cataclysm such as the world had experienced in the First World War. One of the interesting things about that proposal is it was part of Wilson's 14-point plan proposed at the end of World War I for a stable peace among nations. It was actually point 14. And when that was proposed, it was proposed in Europe. The peace negotiations to end World War I were taking place at Versailles in France. The reaction on the part of the French was interesting and revealing about the character of the French, but also something about the structure of solutions to problems. The French rejected Wilson's 14-point plan. They were horrified at the form of it because they said a 14-point plan isn't a plan, it's a list. So it suggested to him that these things were just kind of added together in piecemeal fashion, not representing a fully coherent vision. I took a course as a freshman with Lawrence Wiley, a professor of sociology at Harvard. He taught a course on French civilization. And in that course, he talked about the French preoccupation with reason and order, and that their rejection of the form of the 14-point plan represented their interest in an ordered schema, something that had parts within parts, not just a list. Okay. The League of Nations didn't succeed in maintaining the peace. It was a weak organization, partly because the United States, even though its president had proposed the organization, never joined it. The United States in the early part of the 20th century was still given to isolationist tendencies. it had matured as a nation in the 19th century, 18th century, a continent unto itself, effectively, separated from the major centers of civilization, Europe, Asia, by two vast oceans. So, in days prior to modern technological developments, prior to the airplane, right, there was comfort in that isolation. It was as if the United States was protected by these huge moats, right, that nations would have difficulty transgressing. So isolationist tendencies prevailed during the period between World War I and World War II. So the United States never took part officially in the League of Nations. The pressures internationally that were operating to destroy the peace that had been negotiated after World War I were probably too great for any such organization to resist effectively anyway. But with the outbreak of World War II, there was immediate interest in establishing another international organization that might be stronger, more effective. And in that subsequent proposed organization, the United States obviously would take a leading role, not just in its conception, in its design. The principal meetings for it ultimately were held in the United States. The headquarters, internationally, the United Nations are in New York, even though there are subsidiary headquarters in other parts of the world. But the United States has been involved in the United Nations in a way that it was not in the League. It's interesting that the initial conversations to establish something that could take the place of the League of Nations, but more effectively, began in the middle of 1941, when Europe had been overrun by Germany. The main country that had not yet been conquered was Great Britain. In Great Britain, in June of 1941, about 9 nations that had suffered, largely conquest by Germany. That included France. I think de Gaulle was there. Other representatives of European countries met at a palace, St. James Palace. And I'll show you a photograph of it just because I have a photograph of it. Okay, here is St. James Palace, where this group met and conceived the idea of a new international organization that would become the United Nations in 4 years from that time. The declaration that they prepared is at the heart of all subsequent meetings, all subsequent agreements, as the nations move towards the establishment of the UN. And I'll just read it so you get a sense of where the United Nations began as a declaration and how it relates, you'll hear, to the motto, that I'm going to be focusing on in a little bit. Okay, so the declaration, or one sentence, a key sentence, is that the only true basis of enduring peace is the willing cooperation of free peoples in a world in which, relieved of the menace of aggression, all may enjoy economic and social security, and that it is their intention to work together and with other free peoples, both in war and peace, to this end. There are a number of things to remark on that. Again, I could give a talk just on that declaration. Notice it's a goal. They're announcing a goal to implement an organization to help maintain peace as a goal. That means we're automatically dealing in heuristic space, right? Heuristic space is the space that deals with goal achievement. Now I'm going to be talking about the motto of the UN in relation to heuristic and epistemic spaces. And to make it, I think, more understandable, even though I've talked about those terms and those concepts before, I'm going to review it as soon as I finish this little historical summary. I'm going to review their logic, and then I'm going to show how it applies heuristically and epistemically to the model. So basically, how philosophy operates at the core of what the UN is trying to achieve. So, that was the declaration. That is a theme that continues throughout all subsequent meetings. Those meetings are now famous. The next one was the Atlantic Charter, where actually a few months before Pearl Harbor, a few months before the United States entered officially World War II, Roosevelt and Churchill, the leaders of Great Britain and the United States, met and agreed on the principles of the St. James Palace Declaration and their interest in moving towards some international organization that could facilitate those principles and their fulfillment. Soon after that, let me see, there was I think it was right after Pearl Harbor. So a month after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt, Churchill, I think maybe Stalin, met with a group of nations to formulate what's now called the Declaration. Oh, let me show you some pictures. Here is the photograph. Here's a photograph of Churchill and Roosevelt meeting at to formulate what's called the Atlantic Charter. That's, a meeting just before the U.S. entry into World War II. Then, soon after that, a month after Pearl Harbor, a month after the world is now at war, like all the nations, including the United States, effectively are involved, a group of nations met and agreed to a Declaration of United Nations. It turns out that's the first time in this context that the term United Nations is used. And it was actually proposed by the American President Roosevelt. And again, the idea is to implement those principles first articulated at St. James Palace. There are a few more meetings after that. I have some pictures just to show you, just to give you a sense of the historical progression. There was a meeting at Moscow, the Moscow Conference in 1943. There was a Tehran Conference. Here's a photograph of the principles that Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, again, to move in the direction of the establishment of this international organization. There was another meeting, a subsequent meeting in 1944 at Dumbarton Oaks, an estate of a diplomat in the United States outside Washington, D.C., where, again, these principles are taking more concrete form as the possibility of being at the basis of an organization. And finally, on April 25th, I think is when it began, 1945, that's less than a week before Hitler committed suicide to officially end, effectively, Germany's involvement in World War II. There was a meeting, a major meeting in San Francisco, the San Francisco Conference, and that conference actually had thousands of representatives from 50 nations. It's the largest international gathering in history for the purpose of implementing some international goal strategy. Out of that conference, at the end of April 1945, it lasted a few months, the UN Charter was drafted. That's basically the constitution, the governing document of the United Nations, which was written to basically implement these goals of facilitating, promoting peace, dignity, equality. And it was officially adopted, I think, on October 24th, 1945, and that is now celebrated as United Nations Day. Okay, so that's a brief history, but one thing to keep in mind in terms of our philosophical perspective on things, we have a goal, right? Establishing the United Nations. That goal, any goal, might be achievable at the first effort, the first instance, of an impulse to bring something into existence, but often not, typically not, mostly not, right? If we want to improve our health, it's not just one thing, one time that we have to do. It's usually a succession of inputs. It's a convergent process. We are aiming at something, the establishment of an international order. To achieve that goal, we have to add elements, convergent elements. Sometimes those elements are added as a series. In this case, a series of meetings, a series of convocations to move towards the fulfillment of a goal. Sometimes it's a matter of adding a sufficient number of elements to bring it about. I mentioned that international conference in San Francisco that drafted the charter of the UN involved thousands of individuals, thousands of people coming together for a specific purpose. That's, again, an example of a convergent process. Anytime there is a goal to be achieved, whatever that goal is, we are operating within heuristic space, and that goal is achieved convergently by bringing elements together, by bringing the right number of elements, the right type of elements, bringing the right order to those elements. That's the nature of any creative process in any domain of human life. Now, before I go into the logic more, I have a little bit of time. I think I'm going to have enough time. I wanted to say a few things because it kind of came to my mind as I was preparing this talk, or actually after I prepared the talk. What came to my mind was some encounters with the work, the writings of Dag Hammarskjöld. Dag Hammarskjöld was the second Secretary General of the United Nations. His tenure lasted from 1953 to 1961, during really the formative years. And he's considered probably the single most important Secretary General in the history of the organization, partly because of, again, that he was early on in the maturing of the institution, of the organization. He contributed a lot to its infrastructure, the actual sort of elements that were brought together for its effective functioning as an organization. He also was a very influential diplomat. He was involved in establishing the United Nations peacekeeping forces that went into places of conflict like Egypt and in the Congo at the time. He would personally negotiate settlements of disputes. So he had an enormous international reputation. He was actually, he died in 1961, tragically in a plane crash, while he was on his way into the Congo to engage in conflict resolution. He was posthumously awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the only human being to be posthumously awarded that prize. Otherwise, you have to be alive to receive it. But his stature and the respect that he was given was such that they made an exception in his case. The Nobel Prize Committee did. President Kennedy, John Kennedy, was president during the early 1960s, said that he felt Hammarskjöld was the single greatest statesman of the 20th century. He received honorary degrees from about a dozen major international universities, including most of the leading universities in the United States. So he was highly honored in his lifetime. Now, what's interesting about him, though, as well, is his early background was philosophy. He had a degree in philosophy. I'm always intrigued when I find that somebody prominent in some other field began in studying philosophy. There's a famous entertainer, comedian in the United States, Jay Leno. At one time, certainly one of the most famous performers, comedians in this country, who had studied philosophy as an undergraduate in Boston. Alex Trebek was a game show host from Canada, but was probably the most prominent, individuals in that role, really in the history of American television. He had studied philosophy. And Jim Brown, who for many years was considered the greatest of all American football players, attributed his success primarily to a philosophy course he had taken in college. So we see it operating, sometimes in the background, sometimes more conspicuously. But Hammarskjöld had studied philosophy. He saw himself as devoted to spiritual sorts of pursuits. He actually articulated his role as a diplomat, as a public servant, as being a means of his achieving spiritual liberation. It's comparable to what Gandhi had said about his political role in India, that his devotion to his people was part of the discipline he imposed upon himself to liberate his soul. That the end was a spiritual one, the means was something political, but the end was spiritual. And ultimately, his focus was on the end. There's a book that Hammarskjöld wrote, actually only one book. It's called Markings. It's an aphoristic book. So it's a book that I was drawn to. I read it many years ago. It was written virtually over the entire course of his life. He began writing it when he was 20, and he wrote it, the last entry, I think, weeks before his death. It's aphoristic, so it's concentrated. It consists of philosophical, spiritual reflections on life. It's not a large work, but aphoristic works, typically are small because they're so concentrated. There are a few things that stand out from that book, and there's an introduction that I'll talk about as well. The two aphorisms that Hammarskjöld wrote that made an impression on me then when I first read it and still stay with me are, first, his observation about the true bitterness of death. He wrote that others are allowed to go on living. Now, philosophy at its highest level or deepest level has a response to that. It's a response that Epicurus actually articulated a couple of millennia ago. The notion ultimately comes down to death is a heuristic, not an epistemic reality. Death is an outsider's term. It's not something one experiences so far as we know oneself or by definition. So the solution to the problem of death is epistemic, and I'm again going to return to that logic in just a few minutes. The other aphorism that struck me, again, he might have written this as a young man, is he was writing about the fairy tale of the frog who transforms back into a prince through a kiss. And from that, Hammarskjöld drew the lesson that one achieves salvation, one is saved through the love of another. Obviously a Christian perspective, right? In the sense that, we talked about this before, that Buddhism does not embrace love as a fundamental element or dimension to salvation. It embraces compassion as something that one exercises having achieved salvation. But ultimately, for Christianity, in contrast to Buddhism, the path to the deepest mystery is the path of love. So those, I think, for me, represent the two best aphorisms, within that work, Markings. But the other thing that stands out, and I'll mention it because it does tie in a little bit, it takes us in a slightly different direction, but I think it's justified. The book has an introduction that was written by the British poet W.H. Auden. Here is a photograph of Auden. He was a 20th century British poet. Get this. There is Auden, A-U-D-E-N, one of the most famous British poets, poets in the English-speaking world of the 20th century. He was a friend of Hammarskjöld's, and he wrote the introduction to Markings. Markings, by the way, obviously was published posthumously, right? Hammarskjöld was writing it up into his unexpected death. So Hammarskjöld never read Auden's introduction. And the part of the introduction that made an impression on me, that stood out, is Auden talked about Hammarskjöld's background, what would lead to this enormously successful career as Secretary General of the United Nations, as one of the world's greatest diplomats. And Auden noted that Hammarskjöld had come from an aristocratic family, a noble family in Sweden. His father, I think, had been prime minister, in fact, early in the 20th century. The expectations for Hammarskjöld, for Dag Hammarskjöld, were enormous. And apparently, he was always trying to live up to those expectations. It's a common issue, especially for people that are born into families, of great note or success, fame. So Hammarskjöld had the burden of his family, apparently, to live up to, according to Auden's assessment. And he obviously fulfilled, whatever might have been expected of him. But nevertheless, at some point, Auden considers, apparently, what was Hammarskjöld's interest in being a genius, in operating and succeeding at that level. And Auden raises the question in the introduction, was Hammarskjöld in fact a genius? Now, this is another problematic term. It's another outsider's term. When you look at comments made by, generally embraced geniuses like Newton and Einstein, they're always talking about the effort that went into their work. When you encounter the life of somebody like Michelangelo, he's always chasing a goal that seems elusive. The same thing for the composer Beethoven. that one of the reasons why these individuals are composing work after work after work, we see it as masterpiece after masterpiece after masterpiece, is they're not yet satisfied. They're seeking salvation in their work, and they have not, to their mind, achieved that yet. Now, philosophically, we can say, well, you're not going to achieve salvation quite within a work of art, because a work of art is a convergent result. It's an object. And objects exist within heuristic space. Salvation operates within epistemic space. That's what gives its logic. So, but that's another discussion. But Auden sort of tries to give a definition of genius as some extraordinary ability and passion in a particular direction. Now, it just so happens that the producer who was responsible for my play Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World, that I did in New York a few years ago, texted me just a week ago asking me for a definition, what my definition of genius would be. And I gave him a couple. I gave him the late 19th century definition, where psychologists were especially concerned with the phenomenon, and they tried to advance criteria for it. And one of the popular results was that genius is a high order of intelligence, talent, and power of working, ability to keep working at a task, generate results. Okay. There's also a definition that geniuses are not human beings. They represent a separate species. That's, again, a topic for another talk. But the definition that I like to give, it's my own, and it intersects tonight's topic, is genius is that which can change the fundamental conditions of existence as those conditions are seen or understood or experienced. It has that power. So in other words, it has the power in principle to do what religions aspire to do, what philosophy aspires to do, to transform something that on its surface may be fundamentally unsatisfactory, fundamentally distressing. Buddhism's all life is dukkha, sorrowful, awry, into something that is its opposite, that glistens with the light of salvation, if you like. So just to use metaphorical terms, rigor, obviously, is achieving that transformation. It's a matter of coming to terms with it as a set of limiting conditions, not something approaching rigor, but its final embodiment. Auden wrote something else in the introduction that I recall, and that is, went on to say, geniuses, I'm quoting from the introduction now, genius is the luckiest of all mortals, for even if their work is unrecognized in their lifetime, the essential earthly reward is theirs, the certainty that their work is good and will stand the test of time. One suspects that if there is a heaven, it will be devoid of geniuses. They have had their reward. Well, be that it may, within the realm of diplomacy, within the realm of international relations, I think we could consider Hammarskjöld to be at that level, that transformative level. He certainly, again, transformed the United Nations from what was aspirational only into something that became its fuller embodiment through his work and his efforts. And again, that's why he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize after his death. Okay. I mentioned that I want to deal with the issues of the goals of the UN to achieve peace, dignity, equality, philosophically. And I wanted to do it in terms of those basic categories, epistemic and heuristic. Let me first say, as I introduce this again, for some of you, this will be review. It's, I think, helpful review. For others, it may be the first time you're hearing this. The term heuristic is something that I got from Einstein when I was young. I was reading a book of his. I was very young, like 12, 13. I've told people before I started reading these things early. I always recommend that. Even if you don't understand things fully, it sort of stretches your mind. It makes it possible for things to become intuitive that otherwise you might have to struggle with, for a lifetime without having a full sense of. So starting early, being introduced to things earlier rather than later is something I recommend no matter what. So there's this work that Einstein wrote with Leopold Imfeld called The Evolution of Physics. It was a history of physics from Einstein's perspective. And a term that he used often and that I encountered for the first time was heuristic. And he was using it in the sense of something that's not rigorous, but that helps us achieve a solution to a problem. It's helpful, a device, something that works to achieve a goal. Okay? And that's largely the sense in which I initially, at least, adopted it. The alternative, epistemic, is something that I made up myself, quite honestly. It's now out there. Other people are using it, but I wanted a term for something that was rigorous, that was rigorously philosophic in the sense of incontrovertible knowledge, something that could be known incontrovertibly, through some immediate experience that subsequent experience could not deny or undermine or controvert. The term that suggested itself initially was epistemology, but that's the study of knowledge. And I wanted something that constituted knowledge per se at a level of incontrovertibility. I played around with epistemology and I came up with epistemic, and I went online to search for it and see, was that term out there? And this is now many years ago. It wasn't. I didn't find the term anywhere. Okay, no search engine brought up epistemic. So I thought, perfect. And I'm going to use that. So epistemic and heuristic became the terms that I was using at some point. There's actually an earlier set of terms that I'm going to kind of briefly introduce you to at the end of the talk before I do the question session. But epistemic and heuristic, honestly, when I introduced epistemic, it was my category. It's out there now, as I said, but I don't follow its progress, its development. I don't know how other people might be using it. I don't even know if people invented it or, came up with it independently of me, or if something I wrote, if they saw something I wrote and that it was the source of it. I don't follow, try to figure such things out, quite honestly. But in any case, I use it in a very particular way. As I said, the epistemic is that which is incontrovertible, incontestable, like rigorous at the limit of rigor. Propositions like the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. Two is not one. The heuristic is everything else, everything that's not philosophic, not rigorous, controvertible, that future experience can show to be wrong. That can be laws of nature, right? Laws of nature just represent generalizations of past experience, past observations. Tomorrow, the next day, what has been the case can cease to be the case in principle, philosophically, because the past can't guarantee the future. future hasn't happened yet. If you're of a scientific mind, the past can't guarantee the future because the past is just being generalized to predict future experience. And if you're a deist, if you believe in a divine power, well, that divinity can decide for reasons of its own, his own, her own, that tomorrow will differ from yesterday. And those reasons can be for reasons that are not revealed to us, not shared with us. Okay. But a few more aspects. Again, I've visited this before. Here we have a summary. H is heuristic. In a heuristic space, any two things can be approximately equal for some purpose or other. So again, two chairs are approximately equal. 2 points are approximately equal. Even if they have no properties, they're not equal to the point of rigor because there are two of them, one here, one there. Any distinction is, well, rigor is in the nature of difference. Remember, I've referenced that line from King Lear by Shakespeare that Wittgenstein embraced. All teach you differences. That's because rigor is of difference. Wherever there is difference, what applies to one does not rigorously apply to the other. It may turn out to apply, but we can't say in advance rigorously that it must. Any difference is decisive. So, a heuristic space is an identity space. It's a space where we group things together. Concepts represent such groupings based upon, well, the Wittgensteinian term is family resemblances, similarities for some purpose or other. Epistemic space operates under the criterion of radical distinction, radical inequality. A is not equal to A because they're two different objects or symbols in two different positions. Any difference is decisive in terms of the construction of a rigorous space, a philosophic space. We exist in difference from everything else. Imagine a space laid out. Imagine a space of points, like a lattice, just points. Imagine that those points are mathematical points. So they don't have properties, they don't have colors, they don't have distinctive features that can distinguish one from the other. They're only distinguishable by position. That's enough. A positional distinction is a fundamental distinction from the perspective of rigor at its limit. That's why a controlled experiment is theoretically impossible. That is why science is not rigorous at the level of philosophy. The only thing that achieves that level of rigor is philosophy. And that's why philosophy, at its deepest logic, its strongest logic, its rigorous logic, is able to achieve, again, rigorously, incontestably, what religions achieve in terms of faith or belief or metaphor or mythological representations. Not that their conclusions are wrong, but just that they're not rigorously grounded in the way that any proposition that is philosophical must be rigorously grounded by definition. Okay? If it's not rigorous, it's not philosophy. And ultimately, if it's not rigorous, it doesn't have the power to save us. Okay. Now, there's a relationship between the two. The heuristic converges on the epistemic in the sense that I exist here in distinction from everything else. That distinctiveness of my existence or your existence or anyone's existence can be seen as the result of a mapping, a convergence of the entire universe onto you where you are. And that mapping is unique for you. That mapping of all things onto you is the convergence of the heuristic onto the epistemic. There are other applications of that I'll get into maybe in another talk. But another aspect of the logic of heuristic and epistemic spaces. So again, heuristic is a space where any two things are approximately the same for some purpose. Epistemic space, any two things are rigorously distinct. A way to say this mathematically, this is a mathematical formulation, obviously, but another way to say it using some common mathematical terms is a heuristic space is a convergent space. Things are coming together. They're coming together when we achieve goals. Those events that led up to the establishment of the UN were convergent events. Anytime we create a work of art, we're bringing elements together. We're bringing notes together for writing music. We're bringing colors together for doing art. We're bringing things together. Objects represent convergences. Boundaries. What is a boundary? Objects are bounded. They have things around them, right? They have edges in principle. Those edges represent convergence, an elemental convergence of two things that creates the boundary. So a boundary is a fundamental heuristic or convergent form. And again, a way to summarize that is the basic principle of heuristic space is its convergent aspect. In terms of goal fulfillment, the fundamental heuristic principle is that any goal, no matter what it is, can be achieved at some level of convergence, some number of elements brought together, some number of attempts, some ordering, something. Now, as you say, well, how do you know that? Well, we're dealing in heuristic space. It's not rigorous. You can't know in advance because every set of circumstances is unique in some way. But you can also not know that something is impossible within that space. And you just keep trying, right? The airplane was proved impossible by physicists at the end of the 19th century, publishing articles in major physics journals. The airplane was concluded to be a violation of basic principles of physics until a few years later, the Wright brothers proved all of those arguments and papers and reasonings wrong. You keep trying. You don't know in advance. As opposed to in an epistemic space, you know because it's rigorous and things can rigorously be known. Well, the way mathematically to characterize an epistemic space is it's a divergent space. No two things are coming together. Everything is distinctive and distinguished from everything else. A divergent space. A convergent space, for heuristic space, we bring things together. An epistemic space, divergent. Things are distinguished one pointways, one by one after another, distinguished. Well, what is conflict? Let's take a heuristic view now of the UN's motto. Peace, dignity, equality. Well, the UN has a goal, right? It has nations that it wants to prevent from engaging in warfare, right? Well, and so notice, what is war? Well, war is a mode of convergence. War is a conflict. Things are coming together, not peaceably, but in conflict. Often one thing has the greater force, the greater weight, the greater interest that it's trying to impose upon some other nation, some other people. But when we're talking about war, we're talking about conflict. And when we're talking about conflict, what are we talking about? We're talking about a kind of convergence. When we're talking about dignity, Well, when we're talking about lack of dignity, what are we talking about? We're talking about a comparison that we're making. When we bring two things together and we decide that one thing is greater than the other, one person is greater than another person, one person is more worthy than another. It's measurement, really. In general, we're talking about measuring worth or measuring qualities. Well, any type of measurement, if we're measuring the length of something, we're doing a convergent process. We're bringing together, if we want to measure like the length of something in meters, we're taking a meter stick effectively and we're positioning it, juxtaposing it to the object and seeing what the nature of that convergence is. We bring things together when we're measuring, we bring things together when we're assessing, we bring things together when we decide that something is greater than something else. So what I'm suggesting is that conflict and indignity are aspects, properties of a convergent space where you're bringing things together. I mentioned that within heuristic space, things are approximately the same, rigorously different. Well, concepts operate at the realm of what's approximately the same. Two chairs are approximately the same for some purpose as chairs. So, how do we respond to the indignity that distinction, comparative distinction, gives rise to? Well, we impose a concept of equality upon it. We say that, yes, these two individuals are, one is taller, one is stronger, one is funnier, one is smarter, one is, whatever, we're comparing. One is a better birth, one is wealthier. Whatever we're using as the conceptual basis of the comparison, but we're imposing another mode of conceptual comparison, and that is we're saying that all of these things are the same, approximately the same as human beings. So we are addressing the issues that arise within heuristic space, convergent space, where things come together potentially in conflict, where things come together potentially to allow comparisons that can be seen as diminishing one thing relative to something else. We try to address that within heuristic space by imposing a concept of equality, but it's imposed. It's not philosophically rigorous, right? We're talking now within heuristic space. Within the whole ambition of an organization like the United Nations, if we are talking about fulfilling a goal, like maintaining, let's say, peace, we are talking about a convergent process. So we see conflict is something that arises within convergent space. How do we resist the negative effects of that conflict that, again, we can think of as an aspect or a property of that space? Well, we add convergent elements. That's how we solve any problem within heuristic space. So we create the UN as an organization. We try to encourage discussions. Maybe we arrange for treaties. We do what Dag Hammarskjöld did. We intervene. We arrange peacekeeping forces. We take a collective power and try to oppose the power, of one of the elements, let's say, of a group that's becoming threatening. Now, in the time that the United Nations has been in existence, we have not had a third world war, right? We've had conflict, the human race is given to conflict, right? But we haven't had a cataclysmic conflict. One can't do the controlled experiment to go back historically and vary conditions and see what might be responsible, right, for the success of 75 years of relative peace, right? Avoiding World War III. But as much as any factor, might simply be the existence of nuclear weapons, right? In terms of what are the convergent elements that can prevent a cataclysm, that's a significant element, right? That we have these weapons that are so powerful, produce such horrific outcomes that really everyone knows they cannot be used. I mean, my sense looking back on the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mentioned John F. Kennedy, our president. He was president during that Cuban Missile Crisis where the Soviet Union was installing short-range, medium-range missiles in Cuba, so that they were now proximal to the United States. John Kennedy wanted that to stop, wanted those missiles removed. It led to what's seen as the greatest crisis of the Cold War years, of the post-World War I years, when the United States and the Soviet Union came closest to nuclear war, and so the world came closest to potential annihilation. But honestly, my sense of it is that we know that all of the actors in that drama knew that there was a step too far to take, and they weren't going to take that step. And I think, as much as anything, nuclear weapons have prevented World War III because they simply can't be used. But remember, within heuristic space, we achieve a goal by adding sufficient elements, or the right number of elements. Adding that type of weaponry, might be the factor that maintains the peace. Adding the United Nations itself, to allow those kinds of cooperative enterprises. Sanctions, there are all kinds of elements, but the point is a goal is achieved within heuristic space, within the space in which the United Nations is working through some process of convergence, in the same way that the UN came about because of a process of convergence, persistence, adding elements, adding nations together. The philosophic response is the opposite, right? Rigorously, philosophically, we exist in epistemic space. And what are the characteristics of that space fundamentally? And remember, epistemic space is something all around us. How do you, now I've mentioned that in order to see it or experience it, you want to see the world as if for the very first time, that our concepts are heuristic. And so if we are using words at all, if we're identifying things as being familiar, if we're naming things, well, we're operating within heuristic space. The world first viewed, where everything strikes us as strange and beautiful and new and uncharacterizable in its novelty, well, that's the nature of epistemic space. And that takes some practice to see, quite honestly. There are devices that one can use, but one doesn't have to go to the extreme of seeing what's in front of our eyes, but is obscured by concepts. One can just look around. The imprint of the epistemic on our space is that the world is different in different directions. That is an aspect of the epistemic. And that is an aspect of the epistemic sufficient to demonstrate, for example, that controlled experiments are theoretically impossible. A point here, a control group here, an experimental group here are in different environments. And any difference is decisive when it comes to rigor. So, within epistemic space, first of all, it's a divergent space. Conflict doesn't arise in epistemic space. Things are not being brought together in epistemic space. Things are existing in their distinctiveness, and that distinctiveness is their dignity, that any two things are not replaceable, are not capable of being brought together for a comparison. That process of bringing things together for a comparison is a heuristic process, not epistemic. So within the rigors of epistemic philosophic space, conflict cannot arise. Within the rigors of epistemic space, dignity is fundamental to existence. We exist in difference from everything else, and that is our fundamental dignity. And the equality, well, we don't need to impose equality to achieve an artificial type of dignity. It's ingrained in the circumstances fundamentally of our condition. The equality, if we want to assert it, is that we are all equal in dignity, in distinctiveness, in non-comparability, in the inability to make a comparison that is at the core of the heuristic process. Now, I think I mentioned next week I'm not going to be talking because of Independence Day in Kazakhstan. The following week I will be talking, and for that talk I may be talking about the philosophy of social media, where a lot of the trauma that's being covered for now, like in the American press, arises from the comparisons that people make within social spaces. That philosophy and rigor is a definitive response, a definitive solution to. But we'll address that in a couple of weeks. Okay, I have a little summary of what I've been saying in terms of heuristic and epistemic. And you see, again, back to the United Nations. So the problems that arise that the United Nations is trying to achieve solutions to or promote solutions to are heuristic problems. It's working those problems out within heuristic space. That means adding elements to the mix. The fundamental solution to those problems is experienced within epistemic space, the philosophic and ultimate reality of our circumstance. Here's a little summary. This is from Phalaris's Bowl, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World, and it goes like this. The 2 points have in common forms a heuristic space. It's the space of science and technology and society and political life, where 2 points are approximately equal for some purpose or other, like the interchangeable parts of a cell phone or workers in a factory. How 2 points differ forms an epistemic space. It is precise and rigorous that 2 points are not one. It's the space of reality in which we exist in difference from everything else. It's a space of fundamental dignity in which one thing cannot take the place of another. It's the space in which concepts, which cluster for specific purposes, cannot arise. And so the riddle of the world does not arise, itself a concept. It is the space of salvation that religions have sought and that philosophy incontestably establishes. So that's a little summary of what I've been talking about from a slightly different formulation. Now, what I wanted to show you, and I'll conclude with this, before I was using those terms epistemic and heuristic, I was writing this. This represented a fundamental summary, where instead of epistemic, I was using A for anomalous, a space that was unlike any other space, was distinctive unto itself. B for boundary. NA, non-anomalous. A non-anomalous space becomes now a heuristic space. It's a space where there are internal symmetries. So things can resemble, be the same as other things within that space. Again, it's a different formulation for heuristic. And then I was interested in the boundary between the two. So notice when I'm talking about a boundary, things coming together, that's a fundamental heuristic process. So I was really talking about the relation between epistemic and heuristic experienced linguistically from a heuristic space. And the boundary constitutes our full conceptual space. If we want to, it's just it's a geometric way, ultimately, of representing them. And what I wanted to do is, I have a book and that featured that thought. And let me read it. It's a book that I want to show you also something else. Notice that is a representation. I do art, I do graphic art, I paint, in different media. That's a graphic representation of A, B, N, A, colon, C as a constellation in the sky made of stars, just a formulation of it. A different formulation of it, part of the book in terms of poles, where the statement is encoded into Braille. I'll talk about that at some other time. I've dealt with that in the past as well. Another representation of A, B, and A, of the book that I'm going to read, A, B, and A, colon, C, where each aphorism is illustrated with graphic art. So that represents a visual representation of the book. And just to give you a different direction of approach on these ideas, the relation between philosophy and everything else, philosophical rigor that represents the solution at the core of the issues that the United Nations is addressing heuristically. I will read you this. The title of the book is A, B, and A, colon, C. From that relationship. Again, that was when that relationship I was using that in place of heuristic and epistemic, even though you'll see I start introducing those concepts. I've also called this, that's the book, the whole book. And I also titled this a star book in relation to what I just showed you. And the book goes like this. It's highly concentrated. So this is both poetic and philosophic. These are extremely concentrated aphorisms. You mostly want to attend to the sound of it. The sound carries like some of the emotion that's associated with these ideas. But what this is basically saying is it's summarizing what I've been talking about today. And it goes, heuristic arrays diverge. Actually, I better put on my glasses because I think I just made a mistake. Yes. Okay. Epistemic arrays diverge. Heuristic relations merge. Existences self-justify to claim. Identities apportion to name. Believing to salvation, we mythologize damnation. Dignities, particularities, distance, disparities. Existence to redemption, singularities, perfection. Solutions to worlds bear the dignities they honor, savaging the cares of symmetries to conquer, in soliloquy to tranquility of eternity shown stronger, that A, B, and A, colon, C. So there's even a dramatic but highly concentrated summary of these ideas. Now, that is on my website. So I wanted to address the questions. I'm going to address them in reverse order. The second question I got was about the poem I read at the end of last week's talk, which was Emily is a Diamond. I was asked the title of the poem. It's Emily is a Diamond. And I was asked if there are other such writings that people can go to. I presume writings by me. I don't know about other people writing quite that way. So, and yes, the answer is yes. And what I wanted to do is give you a brief tour of the website that contains these writings. Now, this is all free. There's no, paywall or anything. It's all available free, and there are images, everything on the website except for there are a few quotations early on that I embrace, but basically everything on the website is mine. So that the words, the philosophy, the poetry, and the visuals, the photographs of paintings, the graphic art, it's all mine. It's all meant to help communicate the philosophy. The website itself navigates a little bit like a video game. So it's a little bit of a challenge, unless you know some of the secrets. I'm basically more interested right now in giving you some of the secrets so you can access some of these works. First, the title of the website, and I'll show you it, is thebooksofjoshua.com. That's the title, okay? And notice it's books, plural. Nothing has to be capitalized. Thebooksofjoshua.com. That's the website. Now, when you go there, I have a photograph of the first page. Let me show you the photograph before I actually go to the site. Okay, when you go there, you'll see that, thebooksofjoshua.com. That's the title, that's the website, that's the homepage, that's graphic art of mine that actually illustrates an aphorism, within one of my aphoristic books. But anyway, if you click on the images, you will get to the next page in sequence. So the website can navigate like a book. You click on images, it takes you from the page you're on to the next page in sequence as it's designed to be experienced. Okay. If in some cases there'll be obvious links to click on, in other cases they won't be obvious. Go to the image. Okay. And if for some reason it doesn't take you immediately to the page, just click somewhere else. You will get to the next page. That's why I say it's a little bit like a video game. Okay. But aside from that, and here, let me show you actually. Well, no. I want to show you this first. Okay. It turns out on this home page, if you click just right above the image, anywhere just right above the image, it will take you to the directory page for the site. And that page will look like this. And it will contain a lot of, not all of my writings, but half or so of them, hundreds of works. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And if you look down, oops. Okay, hold on. Okay, there's like at top, there's there are writings and there are links within each of those titles. If you look down, there is a title. It's like, how many down is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 down from the top is Emily is a Diamond. You might be able to see that. Emily is a Diamond. If you click on that link, that will take you to the book, Emily is a Diamond. If you look further down that page, well, you might see there's another cluster of writings. In the middle of it, you might be able to see A, B, and A:C right in the middle. If you click on that, that will take you to that graphic work that illustrates that book, where there are panels. If you go further down, you'll see an entry, the Books of Joshua. If you click on books, that will take you to a 100-page poem that is a little bit like Emily is a Diamond, but it's 100 pages, and it's autobiographical, and I've been quoting from that a lot. That's poetry also. If you go much further down, and now I'm going to go to the actual website and show you a few things. And again, this is all free, and it's all the talks. All when I quote things, most of the things they're quoting are on that site somewhere. Let me just do this. Hold on here. Okay, so now I'm actually on the website, and if I click on that image, you see it takes me to the next page. You can't really see that too well, but I click on the next image, and it takes me to another page. I click on that image, it takes me to another page, and so on, page by page by page. But if I do what I had said earlier, and I click right above the books of Joshua, I'm going to do that. Oops, I didn't do that well enough. It takes me to the directory page, like so. And I'm going to go to what I showed you before. Emily is a diamond. I'm going to click on diamond. And there's Emily is a diamond. And there's the whole book. See? And you can read the whole Emily is a diamond. Okay? If you go further down and you click on the books of Joshua, here. You click on that A, B, and A colon C, it takes you to the page that has the graphic version of that book. If you go further down and click on books from the books of Joshua, it takes you to the books of Joshua, and that is, as I said, 100 pages of poetry. It goes on and on and on and on. So, and if you go further down and click on something, you'll see it further down the page. It says objectifications. It'll take you to a page, and all of those are books. And you can click on each one of those, and they're aphorism books. So there's a lot of content. And so, anytime I quote something, recite something that you would like to be able to refer back to, you'd like to have at your disposal, typically it'll be somewhere on the website. And I can, in the future, if I recite something, I can identify maybe where it might be. Phalaris's bull is not on the website, but it turns out that Phalaris's bull was made into a movie that is on Amazon Prime. I don't know how it works for access in different parts of the world, but if you're a member of like Amazon Prime, it's free on Amazon Prime. If you're not a member, it's inexpensive. It's not very much. But in any case, there are other sources of these things as well. Okay, I wanted to introduce you to the website. So I won't be here next week, so you can go and read the books of Joshua if you want, or Emily is a diamond, or look up things about heuristic and epistemic. Now, we had one other question from last time that I want to answer, and let me just read that question. The question is, okay, I understand why some CEOs of multi-billion-dollar corporations like Facebook, Amazon, Apple wear simple clothes that are just comfortable. They don't wear something super flashy that screams VIP. What do you think about it? Okay. I know I was talking last time about violence against women, eliminating violence against women, and how any display of power is really weakness, right? A manifestation of weakness. The people involved in those companies, like Mark Zuckerberg, are not the humblest people. I think in many cases they are dressing that way. I don't know. But it's possible that they are dressing that way because they are known. They don't need to, wear any kind of formal attire to gain respect. They, in their fame, in their being recognized, wear their wealth effectively, in a sense. I don't know how those people would be conducting themselves if they were not well known, not famous. Let's say they had their wealth, but no one knew. Now, they might still be conducting themselves in that non pretentious way. And then, yes, it could very well mean that. I'm always interested in the phenomenon of Ian Wilmot. Ian Wilmot is the cloner of Dolly. He was the person who first achieved successful cloning. One of the greatest achievements in the history of science, in the history of biology, something that everyone was looking forward to as an accomplishment when I was in molecular biology. We don't know what Ian Wilmot really even looks like. I don't know what Ian Wilmot looks like today. Ian Wilmot could walk down the street and I would not know that it was he. On the other hand, one of the women, actually, a woman involved in the development of the AstraZeneca vaccine in Great Britain, is on websites. I see her on CNN's website. I see her on websites all the time. She is out there in public. I had a business manager, once, a very successful marketer, one of the most successful marketers actually in the United States. He had a multi-billion-dollar international marketing company, and did the marketing for many major corporations. He said, no one is famous by accident, and they're famous ultimately because they want to be. Ian Wilmot has the accomplishment to be as famous as anyone in the world. He doesn't want to be, and so he's not. I haven't met anybody that knows his name. When I ask, do you know who first achieved successful cloning? Do you know who cloned Dolly? They know Dolly. Maybe not so much anymore, but at one time, everyone knew Dolly, the sheep that had been cloned. But people now do not know Ian Wilmot's name. So I don't know about those individuals. It could be the opposite effect too, that they feel they're so famous and so powerful and so successful, they don't need to dress in any particular way, under any circumstance. But that's not the case, because when you see like Mark Zuckerberg in front of Congress, he's dressed reasonably, respectfully in a suit. But yes, it can mean different things, in different situations, how somebody is presenting themselves. Ultimately, what matters is what their fundamental sense of the world, their relationship to the world is. And I don't know those individuals. I don't know Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know. Without meeting those people, it's hard fully to assess what the reasons behind some of their behavior might be. But again, making a conspicuous display is always a display of weakness. And it relates to tonight's topic too, that the powerful nations in the world are in general not parading their nuclear weapons, down avenues. Not typically, right? It's not necessary. Certainly not necessary for the United States to do so, because it's at that extremity of power. And that's what genuine power is. Genuine power does not need to display itself. Any display of power is a display of weakness. Okay, so that, I think, concludes tonight's talk and questions. If there are additional questions, we'll answer them not next week, but the following week.
So yeah, thank you very much, Stephen, for the talks. Thank you for being with us weekly. Thank you, the audience, for your questions. Ildar, Gala, Ildar, thank you. We will address them next week. Please make sure to join. And also, we are not going to have the talks next week due to the celebration, although we will meet each other on December 24th, the Christmas celebration. Please make sure to join us. Stay safe. And thank you very much, Stephen. We will all be safe. Yeah. And see you guys next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much. And happy Kazakhstan Independence Day.
Yay. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Have a great week, everyone. Goodbye. Thank you.